live event. The speakers will follow up with you as soon as possible. I'm extremely pleased to hand this off to Fred Smith, who will be driving today's event. Fred, the mic is all yours.
Thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone to the 2021 State of Demand-Side Energy Management in North America Tip-Off webinar. I'm Fred Smith, and with me today is CPower's team of experts who we're going to meet in a moment. We have a lot to cover today. You know, it wasn't that long ago, a lot of us in the energy industry were saying to one another, if we could just get through 2020 and on to 2021, everything would be less chaotic and we could all get back to normal. Well, here we are in March of 2021, and things are hardly less chaotic than they were a year ago. There are a lot of energy questions to be answered, and that is exactly why we're here today. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to go around the country and discuss what's happening in California, Texas, New England, PJM, and the New York energy market. So let's get to it and meet our CPower energy team. Here's our starting six. We have CPower's Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, Ken Schisler. Ken has over 15 years experience in the private sector advocating for market integration of distributed energy resources. Prior to that, he served as the chairman of the Maryland Public Service Commission. So Ken has experience on both sides of the spectrum here, private and public. Ken, welcome. I know that you have a fun way of summarizing your career in public office. Tell us about it.
Well, I refer to myself as a recovering politician, recognizing you never can quite put it all together.
Well, thank you. Jessica, there go my dogs right there. It's probably Amazon delivery time. We're all in the same boat. We're all in COVID lockdown. So thanks, Ken. And let's turn now to Matthew Sachs. Matthew is CPower's Senior VP of Strategic Planning. He has over 15 years experience in the energy industry, developing and implementing distributed and renewable growth strategies. Matthew, welcome. I know that you're a humble professional. You are not a name-dropping kind of guy, but you did receive some early advice in your career from a couple of the most successful business leaders, frankly, in the world. Tell us about that.
Hey, Fred. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here and looking forward to the discussion. You know I don't love to talk about myself, but since you brought it up, I was fortunate enough to meet Warren Buffett when in business school now about 16, 17 years ago, and he offered a lot of sage wisdom, all which was great and I listened to, but perhaps the most memorable part of that is that he shared his online bridge handle with me at the time, which I savored for years, and when the time I finally learned to play bridge, I lost it. So it's also one of my bigger regrets.
Well, we're glad to have you with us, Matthew. Ken and Matthew are going to get us rolling today with the big issues in 2021 concerning the grid and U.S. energy markets. And then we're going to turn to our deep and talented regulatory bench and call into the game our regulatory experts. Each of them are going to take us through the individual markets and the important issues that each face. Let's meet them now quickly. We'll go around the horn from left to right. On your computer screen, we have Mike Horahan, who has his work cut out for him explaining what happened in Texas last month. Jennifer Chamberlain doesn't have it all that much easier walking us through the always intricate situations in California. Peter Dotson Westphalen will be joining us later. He has his finger on New York's regulatory pulse. And Nancy Shafitz is at the end of the pipeline, just like the market she covers in New England. Jessica, going to switch the slide. Jessica already took care of a lot of the ground rules. The big one is, yes, absolutely, please use that Q&A box. Send your questions early and often. We have a big group online today. We know we're going to get a lot of questions, and that's why we're here. So please send them as often as you like, and we're going to get to as many as we can at the end of the webinar. Okay. Pushing my button here. Let's go ahead and get started. You know, fans of ESPN's Pardon the Interruption will recognize this format. We have used it before. I will introduce the first topic, which is about the grid and its evolution. There has been a lot of talk in recent years about the evolving electric grid, modernizing away from the fossil fuels which dominated the 20th century and toward the promise of a carbon-free future fueled by renewable and more green energy sources. But before we discuss where we currently are and where the grid is going in the future, let's turn to our resident grid historian, that's Ken Schisler, and ask him to shed some light on where the grid has been and how it's evolved on the demand side over the last 2 decades to the present. Ken?
Thanks, Fred. Well, actually, we are in the third generation of how demand-side resources participate in the energy grid. The first one was sort of right around the turn of the century, this century, with using load to respond to emergencies. It was actually pretty innovative, and still today is the most widespread application. We had loads or demands that were digitally connected, and we could provide them as a resource that could be dispatched in the event of emergency. The second generation is what more can these resources do? So DR, or Demand-Side Resources 2.0, was when we had all of these new renewable, particularly solar energy and wind, that can come online very quickly, go away very quickly. We need fast start resources to handle the very steep ramp, daily ramp that can occur, and even at unexpected times in the middle of the day when the clouds come over the sun. Anyone familiar with the California duck curve will be familiar with this topic of using demand or loads to respond flexibly to the intermittent resource intermittency. And the third generation is where we are now, the most exciting, with all sorts of distributed energy resources, not just behind the meter renewables, but things like electric vehicles and batteries that are being utilized at customer sites for resiliency and for other purposes, and can inject energy or store energy as appropriate. Not only use the energy on site, but actually inject it back to the grid. This increases the flexibility, increases the complexity, and it also enables the deep decarbonization that is a strategy around the globe. So figuring out how to do that and implementing all these resources is DSR 3.0.
And that's 20 years in just under 2 minutes. Thank you, Ken. So let's bring Matthew Sachs here. Ken gave us a nice trip down electrical memory lane. Matthew, where's the grid today, and where are we going in the future, and how are we going to get there?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. And I think Ken really nailed it. To layer on some additional structure to his thoughts around the second and third stage, will really be macro trends are facing the electricity landscape now. You've probably heard me speak about them if you've talked much to me, or certainly have heard others, and we typically call these the 3 Ds: decentralization, decentralization, decarbonization, and digitization. And these are creating challenges for grid operators and distribution grid operators, namely utilities. And we have some of that intermittent generation from low-cost renewables that Ken mentioned. There's an unclear demand profile for the expected fleet of EVs. And we've always had, and for a very long time, underutilized generation and transmission infrastructure, as we really have a supply-dominated network. And really, all in all, the grid needs flexibility, and that's what Ken kind of hit on. And by flexibility, we mean the ability to provide power at increasingly quick turnarounds at any time of the day or year, and for changing durations, as well as more frequent calls or dispatches. Now, it'd be remiss to talk about the challenges of utilities, and to not mention that the customers are also facing challenges, and this is more and increasingly complex choices, maximizing the value of loads and assets, their loads and assets to the grid, becoming more sustainable, and increasing costs of their productivity loss as their own productivity increases. And pulling that all together, the customer really needs guidance and help to maximize those economics, simplicity. They need reliability, and they want to progress towards their sustainability goals. And to address these, customers are increasingly adopting a lot of these new technologies that Ken mentioned, but new energy solutions and DERs. Put together, there's an opportunity to stand in between the grid and the customer and help both find the best set of solutions from this larger set and really increase their own value props. So this is and will continue to facilitate a bi-directional grid where demand reacts to supply, which is a bit of a change from where we've been for the last 100 or so years. Over the long term, though, this could even develop into an omnidirectional grid where consumers inject electrons into the network. And I would think about this somewhat akin to the internet, where everyone is a consumer, producer, storer of information. For instance, if you send an email today, it might route through Candace. You send the same email to the same person tomorrow, it might go through a server in Newark. Now, as consumers adopt new solutions, they will increasingly become generators, storers, and generators, and consumers, of course, of electricity. And As grids and utilities adopt to new technologies to enhance their flexibility and optimize delivery, and regulations like FERC 2222, what you might be familiar with, come into play, the grid will follow a similar path. And today, the electrons charging your mobile phone may come from the bulk grid, but tomorrow, someone else in your distribution grid that currently is not using their own excess generation. So I think the internet analogy is an interesting one to think about the possibilities. And while the evolution towards flexibility has been evolving slowly, slower than I've thought at times, but signposts in 2020 have certainly emerged that suggest it's picking up momentum. And I think FERC 2222 that I mentioned, a good signpost on the regulatory side. We've seen greater occurrence of DR events, often from weather events like California and ERCOT. And then utility DR programs, you could look and see that they're often now looking for quicker reactions, more frequent events, and shifting event windows. So I think there's a lot going on with the grid, and I'm looking forward to continuing the discussion, Fred.
An interesting comparison, the grid compared to the evolution of the internet. If only Edison were alive to see it today, he would probably be TikToking. Okay, let's talk about 2020 and what we've learned. The roller coaster ride of oil prices, the COVID pandemic, the lockdown, the recession, wildfires, heat waves, a contested presidential election, and a new president with an administration committed to fighting climate change. So much happened in 2020. We could devote this entire webinar looking back on the year and unpacking its impact on the grid and energy markets. But this is a webinar about looking forward. So Ken and Matthew, what have we learned from 2020 from an energy management perspective that we should consider in 2021 and beyond?
Yeah, thanks again, Fred, and I'll take this if you don't mind, Ken, or at least start. I have to tell you, Fred, I have this picture of Edison TikToking in my head now, which maybe that's we'll talk about in 2021. But you're right, 2020 was certainly an interesting year for the electricity sector. I think there's three key things that stand out in my mind as I look back and reflect. The first is the need for greater resiliency was clearly highlighted. And I mentioned briefly, but the extreme weather events first in California, more recently in ERCOT, albeit that was technically 2021, but I think we're seeing an increasing move or want and need towards resiliency, both in the grid and both in load pockets or residential and business locations. And, the second, that was the first, the second is increasing interest in sustainability as customers and investors make this front and center of the conversation. And I think we've all seen this with big investment groups like BlackRock and you're seeing putting pressure from the board level, but you're seeing across the board, Fortune 500 companies increasingly that more and more substantial sustainability goals. And, the third, perhaps the most surprising from my standpoint, is energy policy was key in the presidential election. I've been in this racket for a while, as you mentioned earlier, and I don't remember a presidential election that really put energy front and center. And if you have been hiding behind a rock somewhere, that the new administration is pretty clearly targeting more renewables here. So I think we're going to see further acceleration of some of these trends, or at least staying in the same trajectory that we expected going in. All in all, we see this as strong tailwinds for demand side resources. On the customer side, customers, companies are more engaged with their energy, and they're more interested in on-site resiliency. All this kind of sums up to more assets and more load control. On the grid side, more renewables are being deployed, and that's a greater need for balancing. Putting it all together, customers will have more ability to shape their load to help balance the grid, and that's a huge opportunity for both sides to realize value from each other.
Thank you, Matthew. Ken, did you have anything to add? A lot of growing pains, I suppose, as we evolve, but 2020 was certainly a year, as Matthew pointed out, where we learned a lot.
Indeed, 2020, I think my takeaway from 2020 with all the things that were thrown at us is that reliability is king. And I would actually throw in there that February event in Texas that we're going to be talking about as well, that reliability is paramount. Frankly, with all of these new things coming at us fast and furious, we need things like a polar vortex or California wildfires. I'm not saying they're good at all, but I'm saying that these things are a wake-up call that how important it is to our lives that we maintain reliability. And we're going to have to do it in the face of a more complicated grid because innovation is inevitable. There are many more technologies on the load side and on the demand supply side that are influencing how power flows on the grid, and power's flowing in ways that we hadn't predicted when the grid was built. The innovation is inevitable. More technologies implementing how those flows will, and how we can predict what might happen in the future becomes much more challenging than in the past when the load was more or less static and not dynamic. Now it's much more dynamic. In fact, that analogy to the internet is quite apropos because the grid is being democratized and complicated with many more distributed resources in the same way that the internet grew up really without a policeman, if you will, and that created some challenges, but it also opened the door to a lot of innovation. We have decarbonization happening, and so we're going to need not only these new innovations, but we're going to also be using them to achieve our climate policy. So all of these things are implementing. They're all coming at us. We have to live through them. But number one, we have to preserve reliability in whatever we do.
Well, thank you, Ken and Matthew. We're going to give you guys a little bit of a rest and turn now to our very deep and talented regulatory bench. Mike Horahan, we're going to call you into the game to talk about the great state of Texas, which has had, as Ken and Matt alluded to earlier, a not-so-great start to February 2021. You know, at C-Power on these webinars, we do like to have a little fun and keep things light at times just to make it entertaining, but there's nothing fun and light about what happened in Texas this past February. Texas experienced a winter storm that led to a series of cataclysmic events that resulted in rolling blackouts on the ERCOT grid and left citizens throughout the Lone Star State freezing and in the dark for a better part of a week. Mike, this was a very arduous situation for Texas. There are still a lot of questions to be answered, but what can you tell us about what happened in Texas in February?
Yeah, thanks, Fred. It's certainly been an eventful past month in ERCOT. So I'm going to try to walk you through what happened on the grid during the winter event, then what's happened since, and then what is still unknown and to be determined. So the week before the event started, we could see cold weather and the projections for high demands starting for the following week. And it was pretty clear to us that there were going to be demand response events at a minimum on Monday and Tuesday. So we started to notify our customers of this to prepare them to curtail their load. However, we couldn't and did not see what was actually going to occur. So over the weekend, demand forecasts kept increasing and the situation was looking progressively worse. Then on Monday morning, right after midnight, ERCOT called for demand response deployments, and our customers responded well to that by taking load off of the grid. Unfortunately, there was just too many generators that were coming offline due to weather-related issues, and this really included all types of generators, so natural gas, wind, coal, and nuclear. It was really across the board, not great performance from generators. So you can see on the screen that grid frequency dropped dramatically on Monday morning actually, and that's when ERCOT had to call for firm load shed from the utilities. If they hadn't done that quick enough, the grid could have gone into uncontrolled blackouts where the grid would have been down for potentially weeks. So it got very lucky that we didn't go into that scenario, and the grid was actually 4 minutes away from this. You can see if the frequency had stayed below the line where the red is for 4 more minutes, there's systems and other generators that would have tripped them offline and full blackouts would have occurred. So it's wild, really, that we were that close to full blackouts on the grid. And ERCOT has taken a lot of flack from what happened, but the fact that they prevented this, hats off to them for that. So thankfully, the rolling blackouts worked and frequency recovered and stabilized the grid somewhat. But these blackouts stayed in place until Thursday, and the emergency was finally lifted from the grid on Friday morning around 10 a.m. So the next graphic compares the winter event that we had in 2011 compared to the one we had in 2021. And so you can see that every number on the screen is much worse in 2021 than what happened in 2011. And many consider that a catastrophe as well. So first, the projected demand of what the grid would have been if it wasn't for load shed is 17,000 megawatts higher in 2021. It actually would have set an all-time peak demand record, which is even higher than the previous summer peak. And everyone historically has thought of ERCOT as a summer peaking grid, but clearly that's not the case anymore, and we need to prepare better for winter. Second, the maximum amount of generation that was offline during the event was 52,000 megawatts, which is almost half of the total generation capacity in ERCOT. In 2011, it was only 14,000 megawatts. So it's really tough to plan for losing almost half of your capacity during a winter storm. So that's the big thing that's being looked at the PUC, ERCOT, and the legislature, all around the market. How do we prevent that in the future from losing that much capacity? The other important figure here is that the load shed, which reached 20,000 megawatts during the event, and this lasted for 70 hours compared to 4,000 megawatts of load shed for 7 hours in 2011. So really all these values are mind-blowing, and this was clearly an unprecedented event. The other note I'll make is energy prices were at the $9,000 cap during the majority of this event. In the past, prices have only reached these levels for a couple of hours on summer afternoons. So the economic fallout from this has been huge as well, and we have seen that with some bankruptcies that have been announced. So that's really what happened on the grid. Now, since the event has ended, there's been a lot of political fallout as well. The ERCOT CEO has resigned. All three PUC commissioners have resigned, with the last remaining one resigning last night. Also, many ERCOT board members have resigned. And now the legislature is involved as well. There's many bills that have been filed coming out of this event, but one I'll point out too is whether to reprice the market for Thursday and Friday when firm load shed ended. And it's really unclear if this will be approved. So we'll see what happens with that. This is all still to be determined, so it's difficult to forecast really what the end result will be, and the fallout from this will probably last years. We do know there will be changes. What those changes are, we just don't know yet. A lot of the focus has been on weatherization of the generation supply and also the natural gas supply. There's also been a lot of talk about having a requirement for more on-site fuel storage. At some point, they may even look at potentially introducing a capacity market, which has been rejected in the past. Also, there's been some chatter of interconnecting the ERCOT grid to outside state grids. This has been avoided in the past as well to avoid FERC regulation. But everyone is talking about potential options, and we'll see what comes out of this as the dust settles a little bit. C-Power has supported a filing to the PUC by the trade group TABA to remove the $50 million cap on ERS. There's been a lot of talk about the benefit that more demand response could bring to the market, and we agree with that. Also, that filing supports more distributed energy resources on the grid, so customers would have more resiliency and be able to support the grid. I don't think demand response could have solved this event, but it can help prevent other issues in the future, especially as more wind and solar come on the grid. So right now we're a month out from the event, and the dust has not settled. There's still a lot to figure out about what happened and how we can prevent this in the future. And I'm sure everyone will hear a lot more about that at ERCOT and, as I said, the PUC and legislature, and we'll be paying close attention to that. So that's my quick summary, Fred. I'll throw it back to you and happy to answer any questions we get at the end of the webinar.
Thank you, Mike. It was a fantastic summary, and you, of course, didn't just prepare that for this webinar. You've been on the front lines of this since before the event took place, and there's just, I'm shocked at how, as bad as it was, how close it could have been to just truly tragic. And you're absolutely right. There's so much that we don't know. Again, big group here today. Please send your questions in, whether they are related to ERCOT. There's just quite a bit that we don't know, but we'll do our best. So let's keep moving. Thank you, Mike. And turn our attention to California. Like Texas, though perhaps not quite as severe, thankfully, The California grid and energy market have been tested of late with wildfires and blackouts, as well as with public safety power shutoff events, COVID, and electricity prices. Distrust for electric utilities that have largely been blamed for the fires continues from previous years. Community choice aggregators are on the rise, and there appears to be no immediate cure in sight for the infamous duck curve. Let's turn now to Jennifer Chamberlain, who practically lives in California's regulatory trenches. Jennifer, welcome. The Golden State has long been a leader in the push to a carbon-free renewable future. Where's California's grid and energy market today, and where's it going?
Thanks, Fred. I appreciate you asking. And a month ago, I would have thought California would be the hard market to address on this call, and kudos to Mike for taking on Texas. California is still really committed to its climate goals and to renewable energy and kind of a low-carbon future. We're seeing a dichotomy in issues in California where at the same time we are seeing some grid instability, particularly last summer where we had kind of an unprecedented west-wide heat event, kind of the 13 western states. We're seeing record high heats all at the same time, which drove massive demand for energy. We also believe that a lot of that is climate-fueled in California. And so while we need to make sure that we take steps and measures to make the grid more resilient, we need to make sure that we're also on a path towards minimizing our climate impacts. And so those are hard things to do together, and certainly things that are top of mind in California. California is a state that relies really heavily on electric imports throughout the West, where we are interconnected to the rest of the Western grid. And last summer, imports just weren't available because everyone had high electricity demands. What that's meant is we kind of keep our climate goals in mind and resiliency goals in mind is there's been a really hard look at the electric systems that are in place in California today. All three agencies, well, CAISO likes to think of themselves as an energy organization, not an agency, but the Public Utilities Commission, the Energy Commission, and the ISO have all been working together to kind of take a root cause look at what happened last summer and pass forward. There were a lot of failure points. No one thing. There have been a lot of press that perhaps our renewables caused our first rolling blackouts in 19 years. And I don't think that was the case. Renewables performed as expected. So we're still doubling down and going on that path. But as a state, really looking at resiliency, the resource adequacy proceeding in California is looking at how to make sure we have energy sufficiency in addition to just having capacity sufficiency. What reliance on imports should we be having in the future? We're looking at how demand response can fit in. We know that, as was mentioned earlier in this webinar, that we're at a tipping point where with the additional change in our generation fleet moving to more intermittent resources, we really need to make sure that load is starting to follow supply as opposed to just the other way around. Measurement on how load does that and how demand response and demand flexibility play in are key roles that are being looked at in California. Are the current measurement for demand response performance the most accurate in a grid where customers are playing a larger and larger role in providing that flexibility? I know I don't think so, and a lot of others feel the same way. We want to make sure that customer performance is really recognized as part of the solution and we have room for it. So a lot of hard problems. I think the legislature is really keenly interested in demand response and DER, all the behind-the-meter elements that provide resiliency. This is the first year we're seeing really significant activity in Sacramento to look at how we fix some of these solutions while the PUC is down in the nuts and bolts of in an emergency proceeding, making sure there are enough electrons for next summer. We don't want to lose sight of the clean grid focus. And while all these kind of both legislative and public machinations are going on, C-Power has been a part of some agency and industry stakeholder initiatives that are a little more below the radar and a little nuts and bolts, looking at how do we make sure that DER and DR play a key role going forward. I think that becomes incredibly critical. And a lot of times our regulators really look at how do we make sure there's enough generation sufficiency, and that can divorce itself a little bit from our climate goals. So I'd say in the middle of all of this, I think we are on a good path, but this last year has been tough, I think, for everybody, nationally and then in California as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. And it was you that had said to me so many years ago that when it comes to energy policy, the vision is ahead of the legislation, which is ahead of the regulation. So these things do take time, but California is certainly working there. Thank you for that summary. Let's now turn our attention to, yes, thank you. Let's now turn our attention to the country's quieter and calmer coast as far as energy crises go. Thank you to Mike and Jennifer for taking us through the challenges in Texas and California. But compared with those states, things in New England have been rather tame by comparison. But there's a lot going on behind the scenes with regulations and proposed market changes that a lot of people on this webinar, I'm sure, would like to better understand. So we're going to call in Nancy Shapitz from our regulatory bench. Nancy, welcome. From a regulatory standpoint, things in New England are hardly boring. What are some of the big items that you can tell us about?
Well, thanks, Fred, and that's right. From an operational perspective, New England's been pretty quiet over the last year, but from a regulatory perspective, there has been quite a bit going on. So I will give you a quick overview of some of the biggest issues on the table right now, and then I'm going to dive a little deeper into one of them. I'll start with ISO New England's Future Grid Initiative. This is an effort to resolve the conflict between state environmental goals and ISO markets, and also to plan for the grid of the future. And I'm going to dig a little deeper into this one in 1 minute. The second item on the list, Order 2222 compliance, is another really important effort. This FERC order requires ISOs to facilitate participation in their markets by distributed energy resource aggregations. ISO New England's proposing 2 new participation models to enable this, and we're active in that process to help make sure that these new models are going to be useful for the kinds of distributed technologies that are gaining momentum now and that we expect to see in the future. So third, just a quick update on the state of things with regard to fuel security, or as ISO New England is now calling it, energy security. And the issue with fuel security in New England is that on a cold winter day, there may not be enough energy to serve load and reserve requirements, mainly because of constraints on the gas pipeline system and lack of forward arrangements for fuel, such as oil and LNG. This issue hasn't gone away, but ISO New England's proposal to address it was rejected by FERC in October of last year. So the ISO's regrouping right now, and we're expecting to see a revised proposal towards the end of this year. And finally, a quick word about new utility programs. We're seeing activity in some of the states that's leading to the development of new solar, storage, and DR programs. We're involved in those discussions and advocating for program structures that work for our customers. The bottom line is we anticipate more opportunities in this area. Okay, so now I'm going to dive a little deeper into ISO New England's Future Grid Initiative. This is actually 2 separate efforts that were started last year. The first piece of this is developing a study to evaluate whether reliability gaps are likely to emerge as the amount of intermittent resources on the system continues to increase. The second piece is an effort to determine how best to integrate the state's environmental objectives into the market. And 2 options are currently being contemplated: carbon pricing and a forward clean energy market, or some variation on a forward clean energy market. And just to be clear, carbon pricing essentially levies a tax on carbon emissions. A forward clean energy market takes a different tack and just provides a new revenue stream to zero carbon resources. The ISO is going to analyze both of these concepts and we should see results from the study they're doing in early 2022. So not a super quick study, but an in-depth study. In any case, if we go with either of these concepts, it's going to take a long time for them to be put in place. So in the shorter term, ISO New England is planning to make some reforms to the MOPR. And if you're familiar with that, it's also called the minimum offer price rule. That MOPR prohibits new capacity resources from offering below their true, and when I say true, I mean unsubsidized costs. So the MOPR essentially can force some resources to price themselves out of the market, and the states feel that's what's happening to the policy resources that they're procuring. And then that means that load is paying twice for capacity. So what are we likely to see coming out of all of this? I think new types of compensation for resources that can provide flexibility, new constructs that shift more dollars to cleaner resources, and finally, in the short term, and by short term I don't mean really fast, I mean FCA 17, which is 2627, we're likely to see some changes to the MOPR that make it easier for renewable resources to clear the market. And I'm going to leave it there, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, sure. We're almost to the question. We've got a big group and a lot. They're just pouring in right now, so we're going to get to as many as we can at the end. I'm going to go ahead and give a little bit of a spoiler alert here as we advance to the final two markets, being PJM and New York. We're going to see some of the same issues and ideas being pursued and tackled in New England, PJM, and New York. A little bit of a spoiler alert here, now that Nancy has kind of kicked it off. So let's now turn to the nation's largest energy market, and that's PJM, and call back Ken Schisler to the court. Ken, we leaned on you earlier in the webinar for a history lesson, so let's switch to current events. What are some of the big issues that PJM is dealing with, and what kind of 2021 is PJM facing?
Sure. Thanks, Fred. And you said it with your spoiler. A number of the themes in ISO New England are also present in some of the other Eastern RTO ISO markets, but there are some key differences. The two things that are dominating the conversation in PJM are how to address the impacts of state policies on the PJM market. That's the MOPR discussion that Nancy referred to. The other is how to relate to how do we deal with these groupings of distributed energy resources like demand response, battery, renewable energy. That's Order 2022. That rule has to be implemented over the next year or two per FERC order, and so we're figuring out how to address those resources in the market. This issue of how to deal with state policies in PJM has fractured the market in ways that I have not seen in my 20 years of close association with PJM. And the issue is whether or not PJM will recognize those decisions by state legislatures, by state commissions through the market. The problem is that if the PJM is operating an interstate market and decisions of one state can impact pricing and resource adequacy determinations in another state. So it's a sort of a federal state controversy, and it has caused, for the first time in my experience, states seriously discussing the possibility of separating themselves from the PJM capacity market. Maybe not pulling out of PJM altogether, but at least the capacity market, they're looking, and I hope they don't, but they're looking at whether or not they should go it alone and not participate in that capacity market. Again, I think that would be unfortunate because having a large multi-state common market is attractive for investment. It's attractive for innovation who want to build products and services to serve that market. It's a serious issue. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission passed an order last year that essentially was viewed negatively by the clean energy community and by states in terms of denying their ability to they believe, to promote the types of resources that they want. that issue is going to be revisited in 2021 with a new FERC chairman and a new FERC, and the states are going to see to it. Again, the other issue I mentioned is Order 2222. All of these diverse new resources, from batteries to electric vehicles, and the continued evolution of technologies that enable demand side resources to respond. We're going to be figuring out with the PJM stakeholder community how to implement that. And frankly, we're chomping at the bit because there's a lot of resource potential out there. It's like the Saudi Arabia of energy resource potential resides in these distributed energy resources, and we want to get them into the market. So with that, again, I look forward to the questions. I'll throw it back to you, Fred.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, a lot going on in PJM, just even when there's not an immediate crisis to deal with. Let's turn now to New York. The New York State, under Governor Andrew Cuomo and his reforming energy vision, has given itself ambitious climate goals and also has brought about complex legislation to achieve those goals. In early 2021, NYSO CEO Richard Dewey released a 4-part video series explaining how economic signals within NYSO's market design will drive the innovation we've been talking about to spur the NYSO grid into the future. So let's call Peter Dodson-Westphalen, who has quite literally just joined us from a New York regulatory call. Peter, thank you for joining us. You must be good and warmed up and ready to go. Peter, we know that New York sees itself as a leader in fighting climate change. We know that New York isn't afraid to introduce regulation to help reach its energy goals. As we look to 2021 and beyond, what sort of trajectory is New York on concerning balancing its energy ambitions? And can you talk a little bit about the role that demand-side resources are going to play in getting there?
Sure. Thanks, Fred. And yes, did just freshly join the call, so apologies if I step on anyone's toes for any commentary that might have already been made. But I think looking at New York, there's been this has been a constant sort of regulatory effort for the past 6 or 7 years now already to look at the market and market rule and market design changes to help facilitate for more distributed energy and renewable resources to come onto the grid. As you may recall, the REV initiative initially was, or the Reforming the Energy Vision REV initiative was kicked off in response following Hurricane Sandy. So sort of these extreme weather events precipitating significant market and climatic changes has taken root in New York. I think the REV has and sort of the design principles and sort of key tenets of the REV have sort of manifested themselves in different forms of regulation. You mentioned sort of the ambitious legislative efforts that have gone through. There's the value of distributed energy resources tariffs that have been implemented. There's the utility demand response programs that have been. There were some early wins within the REV initiative. There was the Clean Energy Standard at the state level, as well as the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act, or CLCPA, that has established pretty sweeping and aggressive goals for both decarbonizing the grid as well as the entire economy of New York. There's essentially the goal of having 70% electric generation by 2030, or renewable generation by 2030, have the electric grid be 100% carbon free by 2040. That's going to create some pretty significant challenges to the grid to be able to incorporate that level of renewables to support that. Demand side resources as well as storage technologies and the market design rules or the market designs to be able to accommodate those are going to be pretty paramount to incentivizing and making sure that those resources can be allowed to participate. on the subject of sort of the minimum offer price rule that both Nancy and Ken mentioned, a similar construct in New York has known as buyer side mitigation has been in play for many years now. Being a single state ISO, there's been discussion around and the applicability of buyer side mitigation to new resources entering the capacity market. The PSC has an open proceeding investigating whether or not they'll need to take over control of resource adequacy from the NISO and the State Reliability Council. I think with some recent FERC orders that actually apply specifically to demand response resources and the applicability of buyer side mitigation rules to those to exclude the utility demand response programs from calculating an offer floor, I think provides sort of a canary in the coal mine for how the current FERC, with the administration change, may look at these issues in other markets. At the New York City local law level, local law 97 is setting pretty aggressive carbon emission reduction goals for the city's buildings, for applicable to both. There are different sets of rules for applicable to buildings 25,000 and 50,000 square feet and larger. That will have a pretty significant impact as building owners plan to respond to that, and DERs and demand response will help in helping buildings to comply with that. So, on the FERC Order 2222 implementation, NISO was actually already ahead of the game in the fact that they already had an approved DER aggregation participation model that was already in place. So they're largely already compliant with that, and they're planning to be on track to have that participation model in place by the fall of 2022. There's a few areas of discord that will need to be addressed to make sure that compliance, their program and participation model fully complies with FERC's order. But I think there's a lot of the way there. And energy storage resource participation models that went into effect last year. There's work on hybrid resource or hybrid storage resource participation models are being developed. And I think through those and between the value of distributed energy resource tariffs at the retail level, allowing for dual participation within those programs, both at the retail and wholesale level, and with the utility demand response programs as well. That's really going to help smooth the way to allow for making sure these resources are able to be accommodated in the system and help provide the support needed to maintain a reliable grid in New York.
Well, thank you, Peter. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes to go here, and let's use it to get to as many questions as we can. We've had a bunch come in. If we can't get to your question, we'll certainly try to offline and follow up. But let's just jump right in. This looks like a Jennifer Chamberlain question about California. Is there a solution to net metering in California, which removes the incentive to increase self-consumption of residential solar, I should say?
Well, I think possibly. One, we are currently examining the net metering structures in California. And two, and I think potentially more important, is there is a lot of push from industry folks to say, hey, the current rules that kind of govern how event performance is calculated all stop when the meter hits zero. And although all these resources are are interconnected for bidirectional power flows, the rules don't allow for that. And so there's a lot of pressure to allow kind of the utilization of those meters to go beyond zero. So I think there are answers that will have to come from changing how baselines and performance are calculated, as well as what's going on right now, which is a full examination of kind of NEMS 3.0. We're at 2.0 now, and so looking ahead to 3.0. So more to come. But I think there are solutions.
Okay, let's move over to Texas. This is a Mike Horahan question. Does the Texas fallout lead to reduced load management opportunities?
So we view it the other way around, where there will be increased load management opportunities. I mentioned there's a push to increase the $50 million budget cap that's on place of ERS. That's been in place for over a decade, so it's time to take a look at that. And also, we think there will be increased focus on distributed energy resources and how they can benefit the grid, whether it's on site or at the utility feeder. So, no, we think ERCOT and market participants will be looking more fondly at load management opportunities and demand response. So I don't think it will harm them at all.
Okay, and then a kind of a companion question to that, we'll keep it with Mike. Do you know the total volume of demand response that was delivered as a result of the ERS, specifically ERS event in Texas?
So ERS, ERCOT has not released their performance and deployment information yet. I can tell you going into February, there is just over 1,000 megawatts in the ERS program. So we don't know how much was deployed, but enrolled, there's just over 1,000 megawatts in that program.
Sure, and to be clear, CPower has been advocating for the expansion of that program since before this event, correct, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. And we think it can help with other grid emergencies in the future. Obviously, we're more than 1,000 megawatts short for this event, but it definitely can help in the future as more renewables come online. It'll help with grid flexibility and other emergencies.
Okay. Here's a question that everyone on this call probably could take a stab at answering, but perhaps it's a Matthew question or maybe a Ken question. What are two major differences between ISO and utility demand-side management programs?
Ken, I could start there, and if you want, please fill in on anything I missed. I think it really depends on which programs we're talking about, but if we want to take a look very broadly, I think we've seen some utility programs, and remember there's around 3,000 plus utilities there in the U.S. of various sizes, but we've seen some flexibility options really start to come to some of the utility programs up in New England, for instance. Some of the utilities, including National Grid, have a daily dispatch program that calls for, I believe, up to 60 dispatches a year, and that's really tented on using batteries and similar technologies to realize some of that flexibility. I can't think of an ISO program that has that type of flexibility yet in terms of structured events, but you could go back to like a PJM sync reserve that you could bid in as many times as you want in a year, but yeah, there's a little bit more control. So, but I do think utilities being on that front line of DRs are very are feeling the pressure of flexibility, and not least amongst from FERC 2222 that we mentioned earlier, which I think is, needs to have rules to put in place from an ISO side. But I think this is going to be challenging for many utilities, as not all utilities have that visibility needed to really center in on that program already deployed in their network. So I'm a supporter of FERC 2222, to be clear, but I do feel that utilities, I do feel for their challenge to work through some of those visibility, and they have the ultimate job of making sure that distribution grid keeps operating. So there's going to have to be some challenges there, but I also think there's going to be a lot of opportunities that come out of there. Yeah, let me leave it there. Ken, is anything to add from your side?
The only thing I would add to the tail end of your comment is that, the RTO ISO grid operators do a different thing than the utilities. And the best practice for designing these programs is to harmonize participation in both. For example, the retail utilities are concerned about distribution system planning and managing grid flows at the lower voltages that reach out into the communities. There are programs to serve that, and a lot of CPower's regulatory team efforts is focused on that. The wholesale grid operators do more of the operational balancing of the bulk power system, the high voltage system, and determining what types of resources we're going to have on that system. So again, it's not really an either-or question. Hopefully we can design and we'll continue to design programs where we can leverage resources to participate in both.
Yeah, absolutely. And we encourage anyone out there on this call to contact CPower with questions about how to do exactly that, how to maximize participation in programs, regardless of what market you might reside in. I'm going to go ahead and answer this next question because I actually know the answer to it. Will we be able to get a copy of the webinar to view on demand? Yes, absolutely. It's going to be made available on CPower's website. If you go to our publication, The Current, under the Knowledge tab, not only will this webinar be there, but to the person who asked the utilities question, there's a wonderful webinar that we just did that was dedicated to utility demand response, hosted by one of our CPower team members and a gentleman from National Grid, whose name eludes me, but it's a wonderful webinar that really dives into an hour's worth of utility DR. So it's certainly worth it. It's on CPower's website, where this webinar will be as a video on demand. Let's move along for a little bit here. This is another Matthew question. It's kind of asking you to follow up what you opened with, Matthew. Can you give a few examples of what you mean by digitization as one of the three
Yeah,
Ps?
sure. Yeah, thanks, Fred. By digitization, we really mean two things, and that's real-time connectivity. We've seen technological advances so that we could see what's happening and respond in two-way real-time connectivity immediately. And the other part of that is computer-aided decision-making. Call it what you want, machine learning, AI, but it's really using computers to make those decisions based on a series of preferences entered by humans in real time. So I would think of it that things are able to happen more automatically in real time, but still capture customer and grid preferences.
Thank you. Okay. Here's a question where someone's asking for a peek into, Jennifer, your crystal ball, which I hope is well calibrated. Let's see here. Do you see the infrastructure of the grid maintenance in California will be being housed in the utilities? I asked that a little bit wonky. Do you see the infrastructure of the grid maintenance will be housed in utilities in the California market? And if so, what might the cost be?
Well, I say that yes, it will be housed in the utilities. The utilities are ultimately both the transmission and distribution grid operators in many ways. While CAISO has oversight on transmission, the owners are still the utilities. So a lot of the maintenance around those and any hardening tends to be on their side, although on the transmission side, you definitely do see some overlap with CAISO, but ultimately that trickles down to the utilities. And it definitely is on the distribution front. I think how much does it cost to harden our grid is probably the $8 billion question. It's a little bit unknown. I've seen, numbers ranging from the billions to the trillions. A lot of our grid is in remote areas, isn't well bidirectionalized. So I think that's one of those things that's going to take some time, particularly as we're trying to narrow areas that might be affected by power safety, power shutoff events. So I think it's a big number, but I don't think anyone has perfect visibility to it yet. I'm not sure if that's fully responsive, but it's kind of about the state of knowledge today.
Thank you. Okay, we're just at the hour, but what the heck, we're going to do one more. We've kind of had a little bit of a basketball theme going on. You should always leave the court on a made three. So here we go. This might be a Matthew question as well, or perhaps a Ken question, but anyone can jump in. Which flexibility markets are currently accessible to DSR and smart EV charging across North America?
Hey, this is Ken. I'll take that one. Theoretically, all of them. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has said all of the wholesale RTO ISO markets must facilitate DSR participation, but there are significant barriers. So actually, a couple of the markets are sort of limited in the types of market participants that can participate, limited usually to just to the utilities. That would be the ones in the center part of the country, Southwest Power Pool, and Mid-Continent Independent System Operator. Retail programs exist and in parts of the world that are both have retail competition, and then also, you know, where you have regulated utilities. And again, it's then in the regulated part of the world, it's up to the utilities. But there are really opportunities all over, but sometimes you have to peel back the onion to find out what really each type of resource can do.
Yeah, I think that's well said, Ken. The only thing I would add is that it's often dependent upon the actual charging patterns and how predictable and how steady those are. So we are actively working with a few big fleets of EVs across actually 3 different geographies at the moment, but expect that to continue to increase in volume and the opportunities to continue to grow. But given time, I'll leave it there for the moment.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. We're a little bit past the hour. Thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Thanks to everyone on the C-Power team for taking time out of your busy days to prepare and answer all these questions. Great job, everyone. I'll answer one more question. This presentation will be made available as an on-demand video on C-Power's website. The URL is right on the screen before you. It'll be on The Current, which is C-Power's new online publication where you can get the latest energy market insights, brought to you by the C-Power experts, 6 of whom were on the webinar call here today. If you have any more questions about what we've either covered here today or about anything demand side management related, visit C-Power online or give us a call. Thank you so much, everyone, and we will see you next time at the next webinar. Thanks.
Thank you, Fred. I appreciate that. You made my job extremely easy today because usually I'm the one doing the Q&A, so I do appreciate that. I wanted to thank the team at C-Power for a truly informative webinar. And if you do have additional questions for the speakers, please put them in the survey, which is going to pop up on your screen once we conclude the event. I do want to thank everyone who's able to jump on live, and please know that if you are watching this on demand, you still have the ability to send questions or comments to the team. But at this time, we are going to wrap up, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.